to protest policing and civil rights, hosted by Defend the Right to Protest. So the reason why we called this meeting, I suppose, was in response to the election result, and really knowing that what we're going to see over the coming months is a massive acceleration of the assault that we've seen take place over the last 5 years. I was at a union meeting earlier today where we heard from someone from Lewisham and Southwark College, where they're basically cutting 200 staff. They're going to close down the Camberwell site. There's a college in the neighbouring borough that is faced with closure. This is part of 25% of cuts that is being driven through further education, the complete dismantling really of adult education. That is just one facet of the assault that we are confronted with. And in that situation, the question is going to be how effectively we can organise, protest and resist. And I think it's been really good actually to see, even just in the days following that election, people taking to the streets. 5 school students in Bristol calling a protest, 5,000 people taking to the streets, staff and students organising against Teach Hire at Warwick University, which forced Warwick to back down before a mass demonstration that was due to take place at the end of the week. And of course, up to 1,000 people surrounding Yarl's Wood to protest the treatment of people in detention centres there. So it's really good to see already people taking to the streets. But I think part of what this meeting is about really is that if we're going to be effective, I think thinking about how we embed solidarity and effective defence against the criminalisation of protest, of the narratives of violence that you use against protesters, and the criminalisation of other communities, and anti-racism, embedding those in our movement is going to be incredibly important. And I think that is really the lesson of the last 5 years. You know, Defend the Right to Protest and other groups that are here today, Green and Black Cross, Netpol, were formed in the wake of the student protests that we saw in 2010. And it's quite important to remember that, because of course the Tories look very cocky now, but we should remember how cocky they looked then and how quickly their faces turned ashen as students took to the streets. And that kind of thing, it won't happen in the same way, but it can happen again. But of course what we also saw is that real violence, the kettles and the criminalisation being used in our organisations were formed in response to that. And I think you can already see, as we saw in response to the anti-Tory protests, the talk of a summer of thuggery, not police thuggery, but protester thuggery, where we saw talk about mob rule and riots in response to a demonstration of a couple of thousand people through central London. That is the kind of narrative that we're going to have to confront and we're going to have to deal with. And I think in that sense, there's no question that there's in a way, the Tories have learnt some lessons from the last 5 years. I think it's why they're moving very quickly to try and make it difficult to strike. I mean, actually, their proposals for strike will practically ban strike action in whole sectors. It's why we're seeing off the back of the Counter-Terror Act, you know, more moves to criminalise and target Muslims under the threat of, under the war on terror with the banning orders, but that will also, alongside being used to victimise the Muslim community, make it very difficult for all kinds of individuals and groups to organise who may happen to disagree with Cameron's notion of British values, for example, who may have a desire to overthrow the government. All these kind of things will be brought under the rubric of extremism, and of course there's a threat to the Human Rights Act. And Michael Gove, who is in favour of the death penalty, being made our Justice Minister. These are just some of the examples of how they're trying to prepare really to deal with our protest and with our resistance. But I think that there is a lot of collective experience on the panel and in the room that should also give us confidence. I had the pleasure to be in court the other week when OTT was actually found guilty of assaulting a student protester, had smashed his face and broken his tooth, and then along with 2 other police officers made up a reason to arrest him and charged him. And you know, this is the only police officer that has been held to account really for the violence that was meted out to those protesters, and it probably only happened because of an audio recording. PC Ott was wearing a recording. He thought it wasn't working anymore, and it was discovered later that it was working. And what you hear is a cop on the rampage talking about battering students, getting a bit of justice back. talking with other cops, having smacked this student's tooth out, about making a reason to arrest and charge him. And that is just an insight into what we know was going on, but actually this time he was caught red-handed, and he got convicted for it. And I think it's really testament to William Horner, that student. 5 years he had to stand up to those bullies, and actually he won that case, and that's incredibly important for us. So there's a lot of a collective experience in the room that we hope to learn from today, to do two things, I think. One is to work out how we can be part of building effective campaigns against some of those new threats that are on the horizon, but also how do we embed an effective know-how in terms of defending ourselves and in terms of solidarity through every protest and through every movement that we're part of. So we're going to hear from some of the panellists, and we're going to open it out to discussion. And then we are going to have some practical workshops for people as well. One on Know Your Rights, one on countering, building opposition to prevent, and one on countering surveillance. And I'd encourage people to go to those workshops. We want to make sure that these discussions do feed into action and do feed into organisation as well. So we've got a really great panel. I'm just going to introduce people one by one. We're going to begin with Aaron Bastani. He was actually very involved in the student protests. He's the co-founder of Novara Media, and he's going to talk a bit about the shape of protests to come. Over to Aaron.
Okay. Thanks, Hannah. And you do afterwards, don't clap before. So, my involvement in the student movement, very briefly, before I talk about the main meat of what I want to talk about. My involvement was amazing. It remains absolutely the most outstanding political set of events in my life, culminating March 26th, completely losing the plot and getting arrested for violent disorder a month later, and doing things that I would have thought unimaginable 6 months previously. And that's what politics is all about. It's about changing what you think is plausible, and that then bleeds into action, and that then bleeds into sometimes another world. So I'm going to talk about an article which I wrote for Vice. I think 20% of the equity is owned by Time Warner, sorry. But I still think it's worth reading. I still think it's a decent article. That was looking at potential flashpoints for protest over the next 5 years. I'll start by saying where I don't think flashpoints for protest are going to be. I don't think there'll be mass contentious street movements around the NHS. I simply don't think that's going to happen. I think that reform to its funding mechanisms, to how it's delivered, is so incremental, so intelligent, that it's not going to be a kind of dynamite TNT moment, what was that cartoon where who is it? Rooster and the... Who is it? The TNT stuff. That's not going to happen, right? And that's kind of, when we think of the student movement, that's what happens. Things blew up and you're like, wow, this is incredible. That's simply not going to happen with the NHS. I don't think it's going to be an outgrowth of industrial action, industrial struggles, as we were so frequently told after 2010. We were so frequently told that when the student stuff kicked off, but actually, in retrospect, was... Analytically, one of the case studies in my PhD, I've looked at the numbers. It's probably the biggest incident of collective action by young people in this country ever. Day X, the original Day X, November 24th, you had around 120,000 people participating in collective action. And that was broadly without an organisation. Now, I'm not going to say that you don't need organisations, that's ridiculous. But in that very temporary, time-limited context, we knew we were going to go to Parliament on December 9th. We knew we had to get rid of a particular majority. It was enough, and there were loads of people on the streets. So the unions aren't going to do something like that. They insisted. I remember there was an article by Len McCluskey shortly after the student stuff, wasn't it, in December 2010? Do you remember this? Wasn't it? And we were told by sort of people 20, 30, 40 years older than us, wait for the big battalions of Labour. Oh, brilliant. Sounds like an army, that's what we need. Because we weren't going to do it by ourselves. And it never really materialised. March 26th was probably the peak. 500,000 people wearing, various pastel shades of, bibs and vuvuzelas. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to bring down the government. Between March 26th and, of course, the riots, we have some really interesting industrial action, which I think, this is not to slam down the works involved, it was to slam down a leadership that really led them up a blind alley. We had June 30th, great industrial action, November 30th, mass industrial action. In London, we had a demo, I think 60, 70,000, a huge demo. There was a huge thirst for an anti-austerity movement in this country, a massive one, absolutely ginormous, and it didn't materialise. Of all that stuff, I still believe that the riots were the most interesting political moment, not just of that year, but they're absolutely the outstanding political moment in this country since 1984. And I wonder if they had kicked off. They obviously kicked off. They were catalysed for the reasons that they were. They were obviously the murder of Mark Duggan, popular person in his community, and so on. But if they had happened a day or two after, or a week after, what happened with the student stuff in December 2010, I do wonder to what extent could the state have maintained any kind of veneer of consent, legitimacy, control. It would have struggled. So, anyway, all of that said, what are the three flashpoints I think where a process will likely kick off? I'd say the first one is the removal of the student fees cap, if it happens. There was a lot of discussion. Tell me when I've got 1 minute left, Anna, because that'll probably be when I've got about 2/3 of the stuff left to say. There was discussion between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives before the last election. Everybody was saying it was going to be hung Parliament. They had some kind of agreement, didn't they, Shelley? For about £13,500, the cap would be increased to £13,500. Now that it's a majority Conservative government, you can imagine it's probably just going to go all together, right? That's what most powerful, most kind of senior elements of the managerial apparatus at British universities want. That's obviously what they want. It's selling for the student loan book. You can't really sell off loans if there are all these conditions, right? Low interest rates, a cap on fees. Actually, the student loan book, which is being privatised, that's now happening. If that's to be a sustainable thing in terms of revenue generation for the Treasury, they're going to have to get rid of the cap. They're going to have to allow those interest rates to be much, much higher because they're going to be commercial loans, right? So that's one thing. I think the student cap is going to go. And I think, again, looking back at the positives of the last 5 years rather than the negatives, you've got this huge layer of student activists who came out of stuff around 2010 who, not just activists, but also organisations and know-how. It's called sedimentary network structures in the literature. There's all that there that I think actually they could withstand it. They could probably mount a pretty spectacular resistance to it. I think they could plausibly even win. I think the one thing that would stop the Conservatives from pursuing that would be simply a loss of political capital in terms of what are we gaining for what are we losing, and they would lose a heck of a lot. Second, fox hunting ban. We're going to have a free vote on fox hunting. And Britain being a ridiculous country, I can actually imagine 500,000 people coming to London kicking the shit out of the cops over fox hunting. There are people probably in the audience who remember the Countryside Alliance coming to London in the early noughties. That was amazing. It had working class elements as well. Right? It wasn't just toffs. And they had no inhibitions with the cops. They were really going toe to toe with the police in Parliament Square. For me, that was actually the set of images I thought that were really proximate to the stuff on December 9th with the student movement. Complete loss of inhibition, complete disregard, hatred, and despisal for authority. Fox hunting is the second one. And then the third one is the referendum on EU membership in 2017. I actually think this could be a really dangerous moment for Britain politically. If you look at, for instance, what the referendum in September in Scotland did for the SNP, now I don't think it's going to happen to UKIP, clearly not. Scotland's become effectively a one-party state. 56 or 59 MPs are now SNP MPs. I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen for any party in English politics, let alone UKIP. But what it could do is it could really... You can foresee a situation where basically all the mainstream parties, the TUC, the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, the entirety of the mainstream media wants, stay in Europe vote. And we stay in Europe, it's like 55-45. At that point, someone like Nigel Farage quite legitimately can say, we have confronted the entirety of the British capitalist class, the media, the political class, the establishment, and we took it pretty close. And he'd be right. He would actually be correct. And I think that if they played it right, if they wanted to, that could certainly bleed into right-leaning street movements. And I don't think that referendum is just going to be on EU membership. It's going to be on Englishness, post-imperial identity. It's going to be on immigration. It's going to be on Britain, but more importantly, England's place in the world, right? Because the Scots might not necessarily agree with the outcome. So those are the three flashpoints. And I'll add a fourth, I'll say the general policing of austerity that will particularly reflect on working-class BME communities and will overlap with how mass migration will be dealt with by border security, which increasingly is actually deep within the hinterland of the country. Right? So, of course, many people have seen. What are they called now? Border Force. They were called Border Force, and they're called Border Agency now. Is that the latest one? They keep on having these rebrands, don't they? So anyway, the latest iteration of what's UKBA and then Border Force. People have seen them, going around London in their vans. That's actually they're on the back foot on that a lot. But expect a heck of a lot more than that. And I think there's a big role for activists, for intellectuals, to really join the dots between the stuff around Yarl's Wood and the action of the weekend was sensational. Wow, talk about being on the front foot about something and setting the agenda. That's absolutely sensational. We need far more of it. But if we can join those dots between the policing of austerity, which particularly reflects, like I say, working class BME communities in inner city areas, and their shared interest with, this is a bigger conversation, I won't go too far into it, but Europe is going to see mass migration over the next 50 years. A huge number of, it's fantastic. Europe's going to be a much browner continent in 100 years' time. Why is that? There are estimates, the lowest estimate of climate change refugees, 150 million people, right? Africa as a continent, its population is going to double between now and 2060. Europe stagnates. People are going to go where there's water, where there's energy, where there's work, where there's means of social reproduction. That's only just beginning to happen. So I think what's really crucial is that, BME working class communities realise a synergy and a convergence of interest with the kinds of people that currently are going to Lampedusa, to Greece, but will increasingly come across Europe. My final point, which is what would a repeat of 2011 look like, is an interesting one, I think. It's an open question. Maybe it's something that people can think about, and as we talk and discuss stuff, maybe that'll be something to dwell on. I think if it was to kick off again, clearly the response would be so much more impressive, not just from the left, organised left, but just actually just general people in general, think much, much better. If you look at when it did kick off in August 2011, I can't remember a single mainstream media journalist talking about it. There was not one tweet. I'm not going to, this, it's 4 years ago, right? There wasn't one tweet from Laurie Penny, Owen Jones, Paul Mason. None of them. Not a single one, because they were just, wow, this is absolutely, no?
No, sorry, I'm
sorry, I thought you were going, no. No, there was, maybe I'm wrong, but there wasn't a single one. And if you compare what happened in August 2011 to what's happened in the United States since the murder of Mike Brown in, I think, May 2014, it's a dramatic difference. And why has that happened in the United States? Why didn't it happen in the UK? There are structural reasons about race and policing and capitalism and class in the United States. It's not the same country as the UK. It's got a very different history. But I still think there is a huge amount to learn. And probably the most important is the absolute importance, centrality of organisations. Organisations with full-time staff, huge email lists, celebrity endorsements, cause advocates, you name it. You need them. You do need them. And I think one of the major mistakes now looking back at the student movement was a lot of us threw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of organisational forms, right? And that's a big conversation I have. But DTRTP and NetPol and GBC Legal, they need email lists of hundreds of thousands of people, right? That's the big task of the next 5 years, is we've got these great organisations, the legacy of austerity hitherto. How do we scale them? How do we make them household names?
Okay, so next up we've got Raj Chadha. Raj has done a lot of protest cases over recent years. He's represented occupied protesters, the Fortnum & Mason occupiers, remember them? Got rounded up and put in white suits and charged. People who tried to blockade Harmondsworth. He's got a huge amount of protest cases under his belt, so he's going to talk about that, and also kind of what we can expect in terms of policing of protest, in terms of what's to come, and also the attack on the Human Rights Act. Raj.
Thanks very much. As indicated, I've done quite a bit of protest work over the last 5 years, and I think public order law sort of reflects the time that we're in. If you look back, sort of the 1930s legislation came after the fascist marches. The 1986 Public Order Act was after the Southall and Brixton disorder. And what's happening now? The government is trying to use what's happening now to beef up legislation and curtail the right to free speech. But free speech, which is what it's all about at the end of the day, is deeply enshrined in UK law, and you can't fight against the restrictions that are imposed. I just have a quote from 1976, but it's there, from a case which says, "Free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the heretical, the unwelcome, the provocative. Freedom to speak inoffensively is not freedom at all." And that's an amazing quote from 40 years ago, but I sort of feel that we're going beyond that now. It's been stated about the protests the day after the election. What was the mainstream press reaction to that? You've heard that what they said was, how dare these people be on the street protesting when we just had a democratic election? They shouldn't be allowed. That's a disgraceful reaction for the mainstream press to have. And the history of the last few years has been that constant curtailment, or attempt at curtailment, by this government. And the three issues that I would pick up on, which is what I think we can expect more of, is number one, mass arrests, number two, undercover policing, and number three, the collection of data, the collection of intelligence. In terms of mass arrests, I think this is the tactic that the Met likes to use most at the minute. A couple of cases have already been mentioned, but Fortnum and Mason was nothing more than, frankly, a sit-down protest in which they were protesting about tax evasion. That was it. They sat down in a departmental store in central London and sang songs. That was it. 145 people were arrested. It ended up only about 30 of them went to trial, because eventually, after a while, the CPS dropped most cases. But it was astonishing how they chose those 30 people. One of the criteria was, how many leaflets of UK Uncut did you have in your possession? Because if you had more than 20, that showed that you were an organiser, and we're going to prosecute you. And I kid you not, we're at trial, and for the first time the officer is being cross-examined, and he's asked to produce the leaflets that were taken from my client. And he produces them, and we count them up, and there's only 16. And the CPS go, oh, we've miscounted. This is a student who'd been put under scrutiny for about 8 months, under a lot of pressure, because she feared for her future career and a criminal conviction. And the case got dropped on the first day of trial when they discovered that they'd miscounted. And that's the type of ridiculous situation that you had. The second case was critical mass. And many of you will know that there is a cycle route on the last Friday of every month to celebrate cycling in London. And it sort of, I can never quite explain it. Others in the audience will explain it better than me. It follows no predetermined route. It's wherever the cyclists want to go that day. And there happened to be one on the opening night of the Olympics. Just happened to be one. It wasn't planned, it just was coincidence. But the Metropolitan Police imposed a condition that the cyclists not be allowed to go north of the river, just in case they went outside the Olympic Stadium. Now, irrespective of whether or not it's a protest or not, can you imagine in the Beijing Olympics, can you imagine the Chinese authorities saying, well, if there is a protest, we'd like it to be about 10 miles away, where none of the media can see, and where none of the athletes can see. Can you imagine the outrage that the UK government would have indicated and would have said? And yet here we were on the opening night of the Olympics. Exactly that is what happened. 176 people got arrested. And guess what? Again, we had about 4 convictions at the end of it. It's absolutely outrageous. And we've had the same time and time again. It's a tactic of the Metropolitan Police. 280 people plus arrested at Tower Hamlets at an anti-EDL demo. Not one charge. Not one charge. And they imposed restrictions on bail for a couple of months, trying to prevent people from attending future protests. 60 in Parliament Square at an anti-BNP demo. The same thing. And a number of people at some of the previous Harmondsworth demos. What the police are trying to do is impose as many conditions on protests as possible, and then impose bail restrictions. And what I urge you to do is to fight that, and if, as so many people are, taking no further action when the case is dropped, then frankly sue the police, because that's the only way they're going to learn if you hit the Met in the pocket. The second brief area is undercover policing, and that's been in the news a lot. But it's worth stepping back and thinking, what has actually happened? So we know, many of you will know about Mark Kennedy, who was an undercover police officer who infiltrated climate change protesters in relation to a protest at the Radcliffe Power Station. And again, when they were all originally convicted of a criminal offence, those protesters, but it had to be overturned when it was discovered that it was the undercover police officer who was encouraging them to take the action for which they subsequently got arrested. And And that's the start of the snowball that we've discovered about undercover police officers. There's an undercover police officer that infiltrated the Stephen Lawrence campaign. One of my colleagues is acting for Neville Lawrence in relation to that case. But the idea that where the state and the police had failed Stephen's family so massively, the idea that they put in an undercover copper to see what was going on in the campaign is absolutely outrageous. There is no sign of the public inquiry yet that has been promised in relation to that. Let's see what happens. And the third one is collection of data. Every time you attend a protest, in some of the cases I've done, we've got disclosure. The police do try and log it if they can identify you and put it onto their database. And they're building up profiles of who attends what demo. It's an absolutely outrageous breach of Article 10. And the courts have not been strong enough yet in tackling that. And we don't really know what happens to that data. Where does it get distributed to? Who gets access to it? It's bad enough that it's collected, but where does it go? And the example of how insidious this is the issue of blacklisting of union members. So again, some of you will know that a security consultancy company was raided a few years ago, and inside was found lists of union members who had campaigned on health and safety and lists of political activists. They had been distributed to construction companies, and construction companies wouldn't take them on for employment. And there's several cases still going on that are being taken by the unions about that. The backdrop of all of that is depressing, but it shows that the need for challenge is there. We need to reinforce fundamental rights, the right to free speech, the right to association, the right to join a trade union, not abolish the Human Rights Act. And I urge all of you to join the various campaigns that have gone up about that. And it's incredibly important. I'm the lawyer that comes afterwards. It's these people that attend the protests that I admire. It's slightly cliched, but I will end with a quote, which is it's an old quote from a mainstream politician, but it's: each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each from a million different centres of energy and daring, those ripples can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and of resistance. That is as timeless as the suffragettes, the US civil rights movement, the millions that marched against Iraq, and I really hope the hundreds of thousands that are going to march on the 20th of June against austerity. Thank you.
Yeah. And that's an example of why you should never accept a duty solicitor and should always go with a recommended solicitor who's got experience in protest cases. Thanks, Raj. And just to flag up as well, in terms of some of the tactics that Raj is talking about, Defend the Right to Protest is going to be launching a project that seeks to monitor in detail these tactics so that we can start to expose them and counter the kind of narrative that we're coming up against in terms of the media. So next up we've got Shelley Asquith. She's the president of University of the Arts Student Union and was also recently taken to court with a number of other students for occupying against cuts to the foundation courses there. So over to Shelley.
You may have seen earlier this week that William Shawcross, the head of the Charity Commission, was invited to speak at an anti-BDS lobby in Israel. Now, we don't know why he declined to speak, but I think the most interesting thing is why it was so surprising that he might, not why it was so unsurprising that he might. For a start, Shawcross also sits on the board of the pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist organisation, the Henry Jackson Society, so that we can safely say that he's not an advocate of the BDS movement. But more broadly, the Charity Commission, in its mission to monitor standards, regularly polices student unions. They investigate student unions with political but kind of usually pro-Palestine agendas. They impose limits on external speakers. And these sanctions do not target the general student population. They're almost exclusively targeting Muslim students and their respective Islamic societies. And we see this agenda manifest earlier on in education as well, with Ofsted and its obsession with smearing Muslim faith schools. And then you've probably heard about the universities trying to shut down progressive anti-racist conferences at Southampton and Birkbeck recently. When there's an apparent concern that fascist groups are organising a demonstration to intimidate conference goers, they use this as an excuse to cancel the room bookings and tell the conference to go elsewhere, as if this is the response to fascist threats. We need no platform policies in universities, and we need them to be implemented to get the racists off our campuses, not the anti-racists. By doing this, our universities are doing exactly what the fascists want, stopping the Muslim community from organising. It's important for me to also point out that these universities have made these calls on the recommendation of Prevent officers. Now, these officers are representatives of nobody. They are government agents who stick their nose in student business and student political organising and try to stir up racism. Our right to organise entirely is under attack with the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, and we need to link up now with the UCU in order to refuse to comply with all of these policies and all of these agendas which aim to spy on students. Samaya, my friend at the back there, is running an excellent session next on organising against the Prevent agenda, if that's something you're particularly interested in. The other campus policing issue is the curbing of our right to resist. And whether it's CS gas at Warwick or batons on the streets of London or the many court cases which activists have been dragged through this year, the universities are essentially changing the law in order to stop us protesting. They're spending hundreds of thousands of pounds in student fees in order to do so, and they're so often inviting the police onto campuses to do their dirty work for them. In my last 2 years of being a student union officer, I've escaped an occupation down the ladder after being chased out by security who are beating up activists. I've been kettled for more hours than I'd like to count, stopped and searched and seen many of my friends, my students, comrades, arrested and taken to court. I'm banned from occupying, as Hannah said, from my own campus, along with many other students at UAL. A lot of people have been saying lately that with the new government in, we need to start being ungovernable, i.e. protesting and resisting as much as is physically possible. And I completely agree with that. But with it comes huge consequences for those who are most at risk by the arm of the law. So in resisting the policing of student communities, as well as protecting each other, this must be the priority of our movement. In NUS this year, we'll be working with Defend the Right to Protest to organise a series of one-day workshops, starting in the new term and travelling it around the UK to give students and activists these skills and this knowledge. We must be clear that with all of these organisations, the Charity Commission, Ofsted, Prevent and the police, that they are all contributing to the surveillance culture on campuses, and we must put pressure on our student unions and on NUS to have no collaboration and no cooperation. Instead, we will fight them, whether it's the government imposing these policies, our institutions implementing them, or the police defending them. Amongst each other, we must have self-reliance, and against the state, we must have defiance.
I would definitely encourage people to go to the workshop on Prevent, organising opposition and non-compliance. And our next speaker, Nadine Ali Nani, she's been part of Defend the Right to Protest since it began, sat through many of the student trials. She's been doing a lot of work recently on the Counter-Terrorism Act and Prevent. She's organising an event at Birkbeck next week on the Islamophobic University. I would encourage people to go to, and she's going to talk more about these. And she's also a law lecturer at Birkbeck. Over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think my talk follows on quite nicely from what Shelley was saying. So I want to focus on some of the implications of the counter-terror discourse, legislation and operations for people of colour, particularly those racialised as Muslim, but also the way in which these trends of control of particular communities also do lead to policing, surveillance and control of the wider population. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Counter-Terror Act as a way in which to understand what I see as a new McCarthyism, the way in which particular groups, individuals, generally people trying to engage in forms of dissent are being threatened, and the way in which anyone who comes into contact with British institutions are essentially being subjected to this kind of control and surveillance. And then I'll try to say a bit on resistance to these trends but I tend to have not much hope, really, with all the negativity. So hopefully the workshops will be a really positive way to move forward. Okay, so in her speech to the Conservative Party in October 2014, Theresa May outlined a counter-terrorism strategy that entails the blacklisting of individuals and organisations, and there's a new extremism analysis unit that's being set up to carry out this activity. She denied that the strategy is picking on Islamist extremists, but all the examples that she gave relates exactly to targeting this particular form of extremism. And I think if we think about what Shelley was saying, it's actually different forms of extremism that seem to be exerting the kind of control and inhibition on individuals' freedoms. So she talked about co-opting essentially, or using, she wouldn't use the word co-opting, of course, but using involving the cooperation of workplaces, hospitals and schools in this kind of activity. And if we look at the UK Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015, we can see that it's most likely to affect disproportionately Muslim students, but also to erode rights and freedoms more broadly. And I think it's quite crucial to start really thinking about this act now. The schedule that involves authorities, including universities, comes into effect, I think, on the 1st of July, so pretty soon. So both in the US and in Western Europe, policies have been designed to solicit the support of teachers and community members who are turned into a kind of McCarthy-type informant system. The informant system stretches to university schools and councils, and they are tasked specifically under this Act with combating extremism and preventing radicalisation. So, for instance, local authorities have to put in place panels to which individuals who are deemed to be vulnerable of being drawn into terrorism can be referred. All specified authorities have to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. If they are discovered to be uncooperative in this duty, then universities can be subject to direction by the Secretary of State and ultimately a mandatory court order backed by criminal sanctions for contempt of court. So the duties are obviously quite serious, and we've seen in relation to schools, some schools are taking their obligations more seriously than others, making students do tests, paying, bringing in different technologies to check what people are searching on computers, etc. So universities have to train all staff who come into contact with students to recognise those who might be vulnerable to being radicalised. James Brokenshirt, Minister for Security and Immigration, informed Parliament that indicative elements include being withdrawn and reserved, and perhaps showing other personality traits. An extremely broad definition. If you think about how many of our students may seem to be withdrawn or reserved or showing other personality traits as being signs of being involved in radical activity. The explanatory notes to the Act make clear that the principal terrorist threat is currently from Al-Qaeda associated groups, so we can understand from this that Muslim students are going to be most targeted and discriminated against as a result of this legislation. Of course, the strategy of PREVENT has a very long history, and there's been a lot of criticism of it as targeting Muslims and leading to discriminatory levels of surveillance and harassment. Senior officials have also questioned its effectiveness, with Eliza Manning-Abullah, former head of the UK's MI5 security agency, reporting to Parliament that PREVENT was clearly not working. Former high-ranking Muslim police officer Dal Babu has called it a toxic brand. And in spite of this, the preventive element is really ratcheted up in the counter-terror response. So UK universities, as Shelley was saying, have already been preparing for the introduction of the Act. I know in my university, PREVENT officers have been invited onto campus along with senior counter-terror police officers to carry out workshops with staff. It's been done in a very secretive way, without academic staff actually being involved or informed about what's been happening, and us hearing about it in quite incidental ways. The definition of extremism, as defined in the government's PREVENT guidance, is vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy and the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. At a recent event in London organised to assess the implications of the legislation, Sita Balani, a researcher and tutor at King's College, suggested a concern about this very worryingly vague nature of the definition, and she actually questioned whether she could legitimately continue to teach her courses, which do critique questions of common sense, imperialism, and other so-called British values. Of course, government strategies of co-option of this kind are not new. Universities have long been operationalised to police immigration status as a condition of being permitted to admit international students. And of course, with the neoliberalisation of the university, perhaps the corporate private university is not such a difficult place to co-opt. Lecturers and teachers are in precarious positions, often afraid to speak out against measures because their jobs are becoming more and more at risk. The government's Prevent Duty guidance issued in March 2015 says that staff are to look for, quote, changes in behaviour and outlook of students in their monitoring of them to detect signs of radicalisation. But of course, years spent at university, as many people in this room will know, are a transitional period. Often people are having different realisations about their lives, thinking about life paths ahead. People do undergo changes. And with or as the magazine, in a way that actually appropriated what was a subversive tool for fighting structural violence. So the I Am Trayvon Martin campaign was clearly initiated by young black men standing up and saying, I am Trayvon Martin, demonstrating that they form a group that are persistently targeted and demonised and are at risk of being killed in the street and subjected to violence, and then their killers found innocent of any wrongdoing. When predominantly white people in France stood up and said, Je suis Charlie, and around the world, they are not coming together as fellow members of a structurally oppressed and marginalised community, but rather as members of the majority, and as members of the majority who are not regularly subjected to those forms of violence. So in fact, however well-meaning individuals are using this hashtag, they're reproducing the very structures of oppression that actually allowed those most offensive images to be published in the first place. So in the face of this kind of censorship and surveillance and this climate of fear backed by criminal sanctions, coupled with the constant rejections of one's own country as being not integrated enough or not belonging, it can be quite difficult to think of how we can resist. I just wanted to mention one uplifting image that I did see around the Reclaim Australia demonstrations when people were in Australia were saying no to Muslims and saying that they're not welcome and trying to reclaim Australia. Aboriginal people who were opposing these demonstrations had an image of their flag and then also a sign saying not yours to reclaim, so targeted at those white Australians who were claiming that Muslims were not welcome here, and then they had another sign saying you are welcome here. So obviously reminding the Islamophobes that they came here as part of a British colonial exploit and committed genocide, and that they remain in colonial occupation of indigenous lands. It also, the reason I'm mentioning it here is I think it consists of an important show of solidarity between differently situated groups who are victims of state racism and structural violence, and shows how strength can be drawn when we acknowledge oppression and connect struggles against structural oppression and violence. Thanks.
A lot, Nadine, and I just think that really underlines how important it's going to be for us to work together in creating an atmosphere of non-compliance around this stuff. And I'd really encourage people to go to, there's an event being organised by the Islamic Human Rights Committee on Saturday, looking at these questions between 2 and 5 on Saturday afternoon, and then there's the event that I mentioned, the Islamophobic University. It is worth noting that the Lecturers Union, the UCU, at their national conference recently, actually people voted to boycott, the new legislation, which I think is really significant, really important. Although, of course, the union leadership then said, "Oh, we're going to have to look at this legally." But the point is, there clearly is a willing there on the part of staff to work with students to oppose this, and that's something that we have to really take up and build on. So look, I'm just going to bring on our last speaker. Thanks people for bearing with us. I think it is really important that we try and bring out these different things, because it's all about building solidarity between different struggles. And I'm really pleased to say that we've got Janet Alder with us tonight. Janet's brother Christopher was killed in police custody in Hull in 1998 in an absolutely brutal manner by police, and she's been fighting for justice for her brother ever since. She's taken every possible angle to hold her brother's killers to account. She's taken to the streets, she's gone to the court, she's gone to the European court as well, and for that, what she's recently discovered is actually she was being spied on by the police whilst her brother's inquest was going on, and also that actually the body that Janet and the family buried, that they thought was Christopher's body, was not actually his body at all. It had actually been swapped in the mortuary. This is what Janet has been up against, and I think that it's been really inspiring actually to see what's been happening in America with the Black Lives Matter movement there, really bringing this systematic state racist violence under scrutiny. But actually these things are happening in Britain, and we have to think about ways to actually highlight these in a much more serious way, and to build much more effective solidarity with people like Janet and whole numbers of families that are actually battling and struggling away, but often quite isolated. Over to you, Janet.
1998 was, well, it was April 1998 was the day that my eyes was opened to just how bad the state is, and just what they will do to suppress you when they're at fault. All my brother did was go to a nightclub one night with some friends. There was a bit of a fracas outside the club. Christopher was punched. He got taken to the hospital. He was there as a complainant. Two police officers that went to see him as a complainant. One of them he was at school with. He got out. They dragged him outside the hospital. Once outside, he was stood up, fully compass mentis. Spoke to the security guard. Asked the police for the name and number because he wasn't happy with the way that they were treating him within the hospital. Christopher stepped into the back of a van. Within a 5-minute journey, supposedly, he came out the other side with his trousers and box shorts down to his knees, fully unconscious, more severe injuries. He was dragged into the police station, and this was all on CCTV video. Christopher was thrown on the floor. You can hear him rasping and gasping for his life. 11 minutes and Christopher died on the floor. It took the CPS and the so-called Police Complaints Authority 2 years before they showed my family the evidence. They had my family's emotions in their hands for 2 years. The reason they didn't show us the evidence is because they were too frightened that I was going to show the people of the country just exactly what had happened. When I saw that evidence of my brother dying like that, I got such a shock. But I honestly thought that the state was going to do the right thing. I thought that the CPS were going to prosecute these police officers for Christopher's death. And when I watched that video, there was a damn sight more to that video than they were trying to portray to me. I could see the actions of the police officers, puffing and panting. Eventually, it took 2 years. 2 years, and they do this to families time and time again. They think you're going to go away, so they delay things, adding to your grief. 2 years before we had an inquest. But at that inquest, we had 9 ordinary men and women. They watched the video. They demonise your loved one. Oh, it was the most aggressive thing going about. We got a Home Office pathologist. He looked at the video and he said, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You can see. That man's died due to respiratory failure, due to the way that the police have just left him on the floor to die. So at the inquest, we got an unlawful killing. The CPS, after being forced, dragging and screaming, to take these officers to court, set a case that would never in a million years have been successful. Say they had to prove that this was an orange. They took evidence alongside to say it was an apple and mixed it together. They did the job of the defence and the prosecution at the same time. That was right in front of my family's face. Laughing and joking. They've been telling us for years, we have to prove that these police officers knew what they were doing. We have to prove that the evidence, that what they were doing, they did in malice. Little did they tell me that there wasn't just that 11 minutes of video evidence that they disclosed to us. There was 108 hours of video evidence where you can hear these police officers making monkey and chimpanzee noises, references to the Ku Klux Klan, and it's not going anywhere. And he's unconscious. But when he comes round and we find out who he is, All evidence that these police officers knew Christopher and the reasons why he was unconscious. It wasn't until 10 years later that I got the rest of the 108 hours. Until this day, there's evidence on that video of the police officers within the custody suite saying they just shouldn't have beat him up the white shits. What CS gas, one can is disorientating, what good would a good harding do? And we should have shepherded him in, put him in a cell and pretended he was asleep. Now that can't have been the boy that assaulted him, because the boy that assaulted him was black. Not just that, they put Jason Paul, the boy that assaulted him, away in a bail hostel for 4 months so that nobody could speak to him. They were going to charge him with murder. Eventually he took the police to court and he won a civil case, and the jury said that the police had charged him to deflect the criticism of their own behaviour. But that day, when those police officers walked out the court, my heart just sank. They'd just murdered my brother, and they was able to walk out. But in 2003, we'd already set it up for the European Court because there's been over 3,000 people that have died at the hand of the state, and there's been no accountability. There's absolutely none. So eventually, 2011 it took for us to get to European Court of Human Rights. And at the last minute, the government gave in. They didn't want that case heard. They didn't want that case heard because any land, any country in the world that does British law would have been able to see that that was all set up to fail. So they admitted that Christopher's right to life had been denied, that his death was inhumane and degrading, and it was through racism. They speak about the police being institutionally racist. I really thought to myself, after we'd got to the European courts, that I'd be able to try and move my life on. I'd seen so many families going through the same, and I honestly thought that going to Europe, things would have changed. But there's plenty of people that have died since. There's people being put in comas. This is not just the police arresting people and people falling dead. This is brutality. They get shot in America, they get beaten to death here. And this can happen to any single one of us. But what I don't want is people to be frightened, because we have a right to stand up to this. You can't just close your eyes to it. For the simple reason, it's your children's future. And the way things are going at the present moment in time, they want to take your human rights away. And that's so that they can do things like this to you, and you've nothing to say about it. 2000, I think it was in 2000, after I'd been to the police station, I walked in, spoke to this police officer who was sat there really cocky, that confident that they were going to get away with it. And I said to him, "What's happened to my brother?" He said, "Oh, due to the fight, he's died." I walked outside, looked at the lost property, there was police bobbing their heads in. Looked at the inquiries, police officers bobbing their heads back, smirking. Yeah? I cried when I got outside. I was broken, I was scared. I've never experienced anything like this. I spent my years looking after my children. Anyhow, I walked into a bookshop and something made me turn round, and I just looked at the door, and there was a plainclothes police officer I'd seen going in earlier on, stood outside. He had a notebook in his hand and a badge on it. Well, when I get startled, I open my mouth, and I just said to everybody in the shop, "My brother's died in police custody and the police are following me." Everybody looked at him. They said, "He's gone now." So I went round the corner, there was another plainclothes police officer. I thought, I better get a solicitor here. I went in, showed her the newspaper clippings that I got for the first 5 days that tried to insinuate that Jason Paul was responsible for Christopher's death. And she said, they've done it, haven't they? I said, they've done it. She let me out the back door, jumped into a taxi, got to the top of my brother's road, decided to get out and walk. There was a patrol car facing me. But this is the kind of intimidation that they will do to stop you. But there's no way where they're stopping me. There's no way they'll stop any of these other families. We had to lose the fear. We had to get out there and fight for our rights. Because it is our right. And it's every single one of you in here's right to stand up and protest. Because if you don't, they will whip everything from right under your nose. You think it's going all smooth? And they're whipping away your rights now. I complained about this surveillance. And I was told, no, there's no evidence of it. Strangely enough, in 2013, it was found that I'd been surveillanced. Up to 17 police officers or more involved in a team surveillancing me. But they're trying to limit it down to being at the inquest. Or it was just at the inquest. We were just worried about public order because what? About 20 people were stood outside the court on the first day? There was already uniformed police officers in the foyer. How many more did they want? So I thought to myself, well, you're telling me it's outside the court, 10 steps and you're off the court premises. I was 17 police officers within that area surveillancing me. So what did they do? Did they wait till I went to get a sandwich and say, wait a minute, she's eating the wrong chicken sandwich? But that's what they do to you. Then, 2 years this investigation's been going on. I don't expect anybody to be prosecuted. But it's opened my eyes and it's opened many people's eyes to what the state does. They want to control every single one of us. In 2000, I honestly thought that we'd given Christopher a military funeral. He was an ex-paratrooper. We'd got him from the army to come and play the last post and whatsoever. People came from other families, supporters around the country that had been out protesting with me outside the police station, but only to find they swapped his body for a 77-year-old woman. 11 years Christopher lay in a mortuary hidden away in 6 body bags. They've told me we don't know who released his body. We don't know when his body was released from the mortuary. We're still challenging him. But we can't do this alone. Us families can't do this alone. We need you to help. We need you to be on these protests. The last Saturday of October, you will see just how many families are out there. And you will see that you are also susceptible. Just carry on fighting. Don't let them get away with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. And I would encourage people to look for ways that they can support Janet's campaign and a number of the other family campaigns. One of which I want to flag up is there was a very big community meeting on Sunday called Around Justice for Mark Duggan, from which there was a call for a public inquiry into Operation Trident and the events that led up to Mark's shooting. They're going to be having a vigil on the anniversary of Mark's execution on the 4th of August, and they've called for coordinated protests at police stations up and down around the country, and I would really encourage people to get involved in organising activity around that. So look, we're going to open up for questions, contributions, people sharing experiences. Who's going to kick off? Yep. Do you mind using the mic? I don't know. Or try.
Yeah, Bobby, you'll probably hear me.
Okay.
It's more just bit of information. With the deaths in